So in the long history of the Academy Awards, what are some examples of categories mostly dominated by men winning year after year, decade after decade, where women have come out on top? Hi, it's Brian. Welcome to the Awards Contender, and this is my Oscar top 10 list of the women who won over the men. Let's start with number 10, Sarah Polley.
First of all, I just want to thank the Academy for not being mortally offended by the words women and talking put so close together like that. Cheers.
So there's two things I'm not going to talk about in this video. One is categories mostly dominated by women, like best costume design, best makeup and hairstyling, where year to year, often we do see women take those prizes. And then the second thing is anytime a woman has to share the stage with a man or other men, those do not count for this video. I am just talking about women who won solo in their categories that oftentimes men do win. If you go through the decades, when it comes to adapted screenplay, original screenplay, it's usually a guy who takes this. I mean, when you look at the screenwriting Oscar wins of the 2010s, it's all men. There's not one woman who won in Best Screenplay for the entire decade. So I do think these two categories at the Oscars are usually won by guys, but thankfully the last few years we've had a few women win in screenwriting categories. One of my favorites for sure is Sarah Polley for Women Talking. I was nervous on the night. I wasn't sure if she was going to pull it out, but I love that movie. It's one of the very best films of 2022, and I'm so happy she took the prize for Best Adapted Screenplay. Almost all of her competition that night in Best Adapted Screenplay were other men, but the name called was Sarah Polley, a great artist, a great actress, a great screenwriter, a great director. She does so many things. One of her best projects is Women Talking, so I love this win for her. Number 9, Frances Marion. So this was a very influential woman at the beginning of cinema. She was a director, a screenwriter, she was a journalist, an author. She was like one of the most prolific screenwriters of the 20s and the 30s. And she was also the first woman ever to win an Oscar for her screenwriting. She actually won 2 prizes in writing at the Oscars. The first one was for 1930's The Big House. The second one was for 1931's The Champ. So right there at the very beginning of the Oscars, at the beginning of the 1930s, we had a woman become the first person ever to win 2 screenwriting prizes at the Oscars. We should all be thankful for that trailblazer, Frances Marion. Number 8, Sofia Coppola.
I can't believe I'm standing here. Thank you. Thank you to the Academy for giving me this honor.
So I adore the work of Sofia Coppola so much. Her movies have such a signature stamp on them from Sofia Coppola. Like, even her worst films, there are things to really admire about them. And I would say most of her output has been outstanding. I think it's really cool that she became the first American woman to ever receive a Best Director nomination at the Oscars for Lost in Translation, one of my all-time favorite films. I was rooting really hard for her that night in the original screenplay category. She won, it happened, it was a fantastic moment. Again, in a category up against mostly men for those other 4 movies, Sofia Coppola took home the gold trophy in original screenplay for Lost in Translation. Number 7, Anne Boschens. Now, it's not only screenwriters I'm going to touch on in this video. Another category, mostly dominated by men. I mean, it has gotten better, I would say, in the last 20 to 30 years. You see more nominees, to be sure, that are female in film editing. But in those early years of cinema, most of the editors were men, and it took all the way to 1940, like more than a decade, for a woman to finally win the Oscar for Best Film Editing. That was Anne Boschens, who worked closely with Cecil B. DeMille. They partnered together on a lot of projects. He was obviously a very influential cinema figure at the time, And so her working closely with him meant like her work as an editor was going to be taken seriously by the Academy. Like she got nominated for editing The Greatest Show on Earth and The Ten Commandments, but she won at the very beginning of the 1940s for a movie called Northwest Mounted Police, making her the very first woman to win the Oscar for Best Film Editing. Absolutely another trailblazer here. Number 6, Callie Khouri.
Gina and Susan, I think you've made the world a better place for those performances. I love you.
One of my favorite Oscar wins in Best Original Screenplay, like ever, is Thelma and Louise. Early 1992, Callie Khouri winning the prize for her first produced screenplay. Like the first movie she wrote that got made into a movie. I read a long book about the making of that film, how for a while she was thinking about directing it herself as a low-budget indie, but then the script found its way to Ridley Scott, and he really took to it. At first, he was just going to produce Thelma and Louise, but then he came on board as director, made such a great movie. I'm so happy she won the Oscar in Original Screenplay that night, up against some truly heavy hitters. Mostly men, mostly like more masculine movies, I would say. That the Academy gave this prize to Callie Khouri will always make my heart very happy. Number 5, Ruth Prower Javala.
The winner is Ruth Prower Javala for Room Review. Bravo!
So this is a name you might not know off the top of your head, but you should. This woman wrote a bunch of screenplays over decades, and she won 2, count them 2 Oscars for her screenwriting duties. For the Merchant Ivory team, she won her first Oscar in 1987 for A Room with a View, and she won her second Oscar in early 1993 for Howard's End. Now, apparently, she was very shy, and like she didn't want to like go to the ceremony, give a speech. So both times she wins, she's not even there, which I think is kind of awesome too. Like that she just was like, nope, I'm good. I can win these trophies. I don't actually have to show up. I don't have to campaign at all. Like she didn't go to the Oscars, but her work speaks for itself. She wasn't only a very gifted screenwriter, I mean, she also wrote The Remains of the Day. Hello, what a great film that is. She was also a very gifted novelist, like she won tons of prizes for her books as well. She's the only person ever in history to win both a Booker Prize and an Oscar, so that's really cool. I really admire her work as a screenwriter especially. She wrote so many great films. I'm really happy that she won 2 prizes at the Oscars. Number 4, Chloe Zhao.
This is for anyone who has the faith and the courage to hold on to the goodness in themselves.
Alright, now finally we get to Best Director, which I'm not sure if you've noticed. Best Director usually goes to a man. Like going back to the beginning of the Academy Awards, decade after decade after decade, it's a bunch of guys. It's almost always men. And like we got the occasional Oscar nomination for a woman in this category. We had Lena Wertmuller nominated in Best Director in the 1970s for Seven Beauties. She was the first woman nominated in this category. In 1994, we had Jane Campion nominated in Best Director for The Piano. More on her in a minute. And then we had Sofia Coppola becoming the first American woman nominated in Best Director for Lost in Translation, who I already talked about. And then the next person after that, I will also get to. But let's talk about Chloe Zhao, who became the first woman of color to win the Best Director Academy Award for Nomadland, which was the Academy's choice for Best Picture of 2020. That movie was in my top 5 films of the year. I love that movie. I feel like there's not a ton of enthusiasm about Nomadland from some other people, but I really took to that story. Those performances, the cinematography, the direction is all top notch in Nomadland. And Chloe Zhao was an inspired choice to win the Oscar that year for Best Director. Like, it had been more than a decade since the first woman took Best Director at the Oscars, It was overdue. I was so happy to see a woman win twice. In director, 2 years in a row at the Oscars very recently. Women getting into Best Director at the Oscars, at Golden Globes, at BAFTA and things. It's starting to happen at a more regular pace, which I love. And a fantastic win in this category at the Oscars in recent years was absolutely Chloe Zhao for Nomadland. Number 3, Thelma Schoonmaker.
Thank you very much. I'm very proud to have this.
Now, I wish I could have near the top of this list a female cinematographer who had won an Oscar. We've had 3 nominations in that category, not a win yet, sadly. But in editing, which I've talked briefly about before in this video, there have been some great wins for female editors. And I mean, one of the landmark editors in all of cinema history is Thelma Schoonmaker, who is the only female editor to have 3. She has won 3 times, all for Martin Scorsese movies, Raging Bull, The Aviator, and The Departed. 3 all-timer wins. I love all of those victories for Schoonmaker. She is still collaborating with Martin Scorsese to this day. She is such an inspiration in the field of film editing. I have always looked up to her. I imagine most people in that profession, people who edits day by day in whatever they do, they are going to look up to Thelma Schoonmaker. She is one of the all-time greats. I'm so happy she has won 3 prizes at the Oscars for her work. Number 2, Jane Campion.
Thank you, Kevin. That was very dramatic.
I told you I'd be coming back to her, so Jane Campion has to be near the top of any list like this. Because, I mean, she's been breaking barriers for decades, has made so many incredible films with amazing actors, amazing cinematography. One of her finest films is The Piano from 1993, which made her only the 2nd woman to ever be nominated for Best Director at the Oscars. She did indeed win a prize that night for Best Original Screenplay, so well deserved. I'm happy she at least won that. For a movie that got into Best Picture, that won Best Actress for Holly Hunter, Best Supporting Actress for Anna Paquin. Like, that was a beloved movie that year. It's too bad she couldn't also win Best Director, but that was the year of Schindler's List, and like, Steven Spielberg was winning that one. But flash forward a handful of decades and we get to 2021's The Power of the Dog. And even though that movie could not win like anything that night, despite its 12 nominations at the Oscars in a variety of categories, including Best Picture and Director and Actor, Supporting Actor, Supporting Actress, Screenplay, technical categories, that movie did very well in its number of nominations. It just really couldn't win any big prizes except for Best Director. In a field of a bunch of talented men, Jane Campion was the victor that night for her work on The Power of the Dog. So well deserved. She gave a great speech. I love how she kind of shooed Kevin Costner away at the beginning. It always makes me laugh. With her victory, she became the 3rd woman to ever win Best Director at the Oscars. And that takes me to the number 1 choice. I have to go with the very first woman to ever win Best Director at the Academy Awards. My number 1 choice in this video is Kathryn Bigelow.
This really is, there's no other way to describe it. It's the moment of a lifetime.
This was a truly historic moment. Think about it. The Academy Awards began at the end of the 1920s. It took until 2010, like more than 80 years later, for a woman to finally win Best Director. Like, that's a very long time. You think about all the extraordinary work in cinema by women over the decades, and like, it was so hard just to get them nominated. It's absurd. It's not a good look for the Academy that it took that long for a woman to finally win in director. But we got to 2009 and The Hurt Locker, which also ended up winning Best Picture for that year. and it was just undeniable. That was one of the most powerful films of that year, and Kathryn Bigelow had been making so many interesting films in a variety of genres like Near Dark and Point Break and Strange Days and countless others. The Hurt Locker is one of her very best. Her really only competition in the category that year was her former husband, James Cameron, for Avatar. He won Best Director at the Golden Globes, and so, like, there was a competition there. She didn't have this in the bag, I would say, by Oscar nights, even though it was looking pretty good for her by the end of that season. I have explored this Best Director competition in a video I made a few months ago, and it was fascinating to look back and see just how momentous this was. You can feel the emotion in Barbra Streisand's voice when she says,
"Well, the time has come. Kathryn Bigelow!"
I mean, Barbra Streisand is another gifted filmmaker who never even got an Academy Award nomination for Best Director. She absolutely deserved too, like for Yentl and The Prince of Tides, and it didn't happen. Finally, we get to Kathryn Bigelow in early 2010, and it just could not be denied. This moment had to happen, and it's just a fantastic victory in this category, one of my all-time favorites. I love her speech. I love that she also got to win Best Picture that night. And yeah, I just hope we get more Kathryn Bigelow movies down the pipeline. Like, what's going on there? I want to see more Kathryn Bigelow cinema sooner rather than later. She is such a stunning filmmaker, the first woman to ever win the Oscar for Best Director. And you know what? Whenever a woman becomes the first of something in a field that's been dominated by men for years, for decades, for centuries, that is always a reason to celebrate.